Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Cunningham Cameron, and I'm the Curator of Contemporary Design and Hinds Secretarial Scholar at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today for Willi Smith on the Record, a conversation amongst a group of writers and editors whose work has contributed to a broader understanding of American designer Willi Smith. We're grateful to all of them for sharing their time today. Each one has been a collaborator in some way over the past 3 years of researching and discussing Willi Smith's life and work. This talk is the last in Cooper Hewitt's series of public programs in conjunction with the exhibition Willi Smith Street Couture, which is on view through October 24th. If you're able to come to New York or you live in New York, I encourage you to see the exhibition if you haven't yet, which was made possible with principal support from Target. You may also visit our website to view recordings of our full program of talks that have included speakers like Beth Ann Hardison, Virgil Abloh, Jacoby Satterwhite, Dario Calmese, and James Wines, as well as the first session of the Fashion Culture Futures African American Ingenuity, Activism, and Storytelling Symposium, which we co-organize with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Session 2 of the symposium is coming up, hosted by Namak on October 21st. So if you want more information about that, we'd be happy to share. The conversation today will last until around 3:10 p.m. Eastern Time, at which point our moderator will pose questions to all the panelists from you, our audience. So if you have a question you'd like to submit, please enter it in the Q&A box in the bottom of the panel of your Zoom screen at any point during the conversation, and we'll spend some time answering questions towards the end. And before I introduce our moderator, I wanted to begin with a few words about Willi Smith. His career launched after being asked to leave Parsons in 1967 and ended when he died in 1987 of complications from AIDS. And at that time, he was considered to be the most commercially successful Black American designer in fashion history. He's thought by many to be the father of streetwear for launching the brand WilliWear in 1976 with his partner Lori Mallet. And designing what he called street couture, which was essentially unstructured and vibrant clothing inspired by and made for the people he watched moving on the street every day. But his contribution as a designer and as a catalyst for creative exchange and social impact is significantly more complex than his role in creating a bridge between the American sportswear industry and street style. It's clear that Willi Smith operated within the fashion system of his time as an agent of change. He championed an inclusive view of fashion, which was reflective of and inspired by diverse people and cultures, that was affordable, adaptable, utilitarian, and very importantly, fun. He infused everything he did with a wry sense of play. Play was extremely important. And he saw that working women, the expanding Black middle class, queer communities, artists, and performers were restricted by fashion codes that undermined free and personal expression. And so he designed clothing that was basic, what he referred to as a canvas and a tool for individuality, that asked to be mixed and matched, that transitioned from day into night, that worked from season to season and didn't have to be replaced to keep up with trends. The idea was that if you were wearing WilliWear, no one knew what was in your bank account. So Willi Smith was trying to put fashion in service of different types of lifestyles, rather than conformity to the dictates of editors or the binary between luxury fashion and anonymous sportswear, moral codes. He created a link between the industry and style emerging from the street. He was connecting with communities of artists, workwear, hip hop, drag ball culture in a way that permanently changed the fashion system. WilliWear's presentations were happenings that combined art, music, and fashion within an atmosphere of improvisation. The brand managed to position affordable fashion as a means of personal change and transformation growth. Smith was a pioneer of the type of multidisciplinary, multi-hyphenate design careers that have become common, perhaps even expected today. And he collaborated constantly, producing films, designing costumes for performances, creating the first artist designed t-shirts, making conceptual installations. And he worked with Keith Haring, Diane McIntyre, June Paik, Barbara Kruger, Dan Friedman, and an extensive roster of influential artists. He most often worked with artists who shared his ethos. His collaboration spoke to the transformation of popular culture into fine art, technology as a democratic medium, and multifaceted expressions of Black and queer experience. He wanted to make art more accessible to his audience, to his customers, whom he felt were often intimidated by elite spaces, museums, and galleries. He was definitely a proponent of the art of life. And to Willi Smith, clothing could really be a force of equity. So our conversation today is moderated by fashion journalist, critic, and consultant Pierre M. Pellet. Pierre is formerly the senior editor of Love magazine and founder of the periodic publication Screenshot. Pierre has joined Katie Gran's A Perfect magazine, where he currently serves as associate editor. The magazine has just celebrated the launch of its issue 1, titled Perfect Joy. Congratulations to everyone. I know that just happened. And so now I will hand the mic over to Pierre, who will share a brief overview of our conversation and introduce the rest of our panelists. Thank you so much to everyone, and over to you, Pierre.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Pierre, as Alexandra just said, and I'll start with introducing our panelists. We've got Jared Ernest today, who is a fabulous author, curator, and artist. He's authored many books, including What It Means to Write About Art. I've met with Jared just today, actually, and we're very happy to have you. So we've got Camille Okio, and Camille is an art and design historian and writer living and working in New York City. And I've met her we're meeting through Zoom. And we've got William Datira, who is a consultant, contributing editor for Fantastic Man, and a fellow Central St. Martin's alumni. I think those were good introductions. If not, feel free to introduce yourself in a few minutes. We'll be talking about Willi Smith, obviously. I came across Willi Smith when I was researching at Central St. Martin's, studying fashion journalism. And what struck me was that his clothes were not only culturally relevant through the collaborations that he was famous for, but also really well designed. And those elements to me is what make him a great fashion designer. He's oftentimes forgotten, and one of the names that we need to keep alive because his work and his legacy are great. So we'll start the conversation with fashion and art. Is fashion art? Willi Smith was a designer who loved to collaborate with artists, as Alexandra just mentioned. And it's something that today have been prevailing in the fashion industry, but he truly initiated those sort of collaboration between artists and designers. So Willi, would you want to try and answer that first question? Is fashion art? And
Yeah, hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Well, that goes back to the piece I've just written for The Perfect magazine, which was asking the same question. And there's no easy answer. But with regards to Willi Smith, I think for me, when there's a question, is fashion art, is always about what is the context. It's the same. Art is also defined by the gallery system where it's being shown, the museums, etc. So fashion can be art if it's in the right context, but fashion usually isn't worried about the bigger question. It's generally about identity. It's generally about, for the 20th century with modernity, it was for a lot of brands, and Willi is the opposite of that. They tend to be more obsessed with defining who is the Coco Chanel woman, who is the Saint Laurent woman, who is, so it was really based on identity and trying to define the modern woman and modernizing women and what they were. And I think with Willi Smith, it was really kind of a good balance of collaborating and being an artist. He worked like an artist, I think, from the interiors of his shops to the collaborations to the purpose of what he made.
And when did you first hear about Willi Smith and his story?
I basically hosted a Gucci podcast, which is on I think it's on their website, it's on SoundCloud. I had a really an amazing kind of opportunity to have a conversation with Bethan Hardison and Kim Hastreiter, the founder of Paper Magazine. And they both, in the podcast, explain how he was instrumental in creating what Paper Magazine became. He gave her sort of like first, you would call it her first big break, because as a brand, he commissioned her to do supplements, and he would, encourage her. And at the same time, financially, it helped to be for Kim to be associated with a bigger brand. And they were in the same building as well, which was quite funny. He lived downtown in New York when it wasn't really fashionable, when it was really run down, and he would come home in his limousine and go to the office in his limousine, and it just really looked out of place, but he didn't really care. So apparently it was a really interesting moment for Kim's life, and how much he helped her. As for Bethan, she's almost kind of a figurehead for Black models, for any Black talent, because she's been an advocate for diversity in the industry. And through her agency, even though her agency has models of all races, she's always been kind of outspoken about major magazine hiring and featuring people of color. So she got, I think, her first modeling break through Willi as well. He met her through his sister. Is it Tuki? Yes, Tuki, who was the muse. So it was really interesting. So that's how I discovered him. Sadly, I should have known about him, and I think I'm really surprised by how much his history and his work has been erased, and his influence. So
Right.
that's a bit of a weird one, but yeah.
Jared, when did you first hear about Willi Smith, and what about his stories spoke to you? You are on mute.
I was just testing you. So I was working on Christo. I'm an art person, and I think that I'm kind of feel like I'm on this panel to speak on like the art perspective. And I actually do have some thoughts about this question of the relationship of art and fashion that I'd really like to put some pressure on, because I think that I think there's a lot there that shouldn't be just glided over in a kind of facile way. But for how I got involved with Willi Smith, as a good devotee of conceptual art, I really liked Jeanne Claude and Christo. And I was writing a story. I went on a boat ride with Christo around Miami a few years ago when they were doing a show about looking back at the Surrounded Islands projects that they had done in Miami. And I called, I'm from South Florida, and I know that Alexandra grew up in Miami. And so I called her and got a quote for, you know, what it was like as a child to see the visual impact of Surrounded Islands and its ephemera on the city. And then when she started working on Willi Smith, Willi Smith was very close friends with Jeanne Claude and Christo and collaborated with them a number of times. And they were kind of important figures in his life, and vice versa. And including that he made the uniforms that the t-shirts and the hats that people wore when they weren't volunteers, but the people who were hired to help with Surrounded Islands. And so that was kind of my first thing, where I was really interested in the tracking that stuff down and the t-shirts. And then they also, Willi designed the jackets that the people who worked on the wrapping of the Pont Neuf wore slightly later. So when she started working on this show, she reached out to me and asked if I wanted to work on Willi Smith from that angle, from the kind of conceptual art angle. And then I just really fell in love, you know, and part of what I fell in love with was the idea that this was a guy who had a vision for living. You know, the clothes were about a bigger picture of how to live in a society and conduct yourself and have relationships. And, you know, Beth Ann, I love that you mentioned your conversation with Beth Ann Hardison, and something she said in that podcast, and also something that she said multiple times talking about Willi Smith, was that Willi Smith was an artist. She said, it's important that you understand he was an artist. He worked with clothes and fashion. And for someone like Beth Ann Hardison, who is such a towering figure of fashion, who's dedicated her entire life to fashion and advocating for it as an important cultural activity, but for her to make that distinction over and over, Willi Smith was not just a fashion designer, he was an artist. That is something that I really have been meditating on. It's something I really want to follow, because what does it mean for her to make that distinction? And how can we learn from the wisdom of it? And partly my partial answer, and I would like to turn it over to the other panelists, it does have to do with this bigger, more holistic vision, a very philosophical vision about moving through the world and what it looks like, and how money relates to that, and also how social space and private space relate to that. You know, I think all right, and I think I could talk a lot about that, but I want to push the ball to my fellow panelists, and then maybe we could pick some of those things up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you started a really interesting conversation. Camille, who's also, by the way, the senior design writer at Elle Decor, what and how did you first encounter Willi Smith, and what about his story resonated with you?
Well, I remember coming across Willi Smith articles of clothing in my mother's wardrobe as a child, and also like as a teenager, finding little pieces here and there at thrift stores, but not really understanding the relevance and the importance of him as a designer until I wrote about him and his home and his kind of interior world and interior life for Apartamento last year, which was something that came through Alexandra as well, who seems to really be the glue here. My thoughts pertaining to that distinction between fashion and art, the traditional response, of course, is function and how art doesn't need to have one. Fashion, of course, does. It's clothing. We don't have to wear it, but we've grown accustomed to wearing it. But Willi, I think I would agree with Jared, and I would agree with Beth Ann Hardison that he was an artist from my perspective, at least, while I was researching him. One of the things that really resonated with me while I was having conversations with the people who knew him was Lori Mallet referencing WilliWear as an idea company, not a fashion brand, an idea company. And it seems to me that Willi really used fashion, and he used the presentation of it, and he used the context within which he presented it to the world as his medium. And it was kind of something of a test kitchen. As I started to read about his collecting practices, the way he liked to live, the way he interacted with his friends, it became really apparent that this is a voracious mind. He was constantly reading, collecting. His sketchbooks, one of which I believe is in the Cooper Hewitt show, were almost like collages. And collaging is something the writer Sacha Bonnet referred to as a historical practice of the Black imagination, I believe is what she said in a Paris Review article earlier this year. And I think that really applies to the way that Willi consumed information. He brought it all together in this kind of organic way and reinterpreted what he saw, brought together kind of disparate fields. I mean, there were themes in his sketchbooks like ancient Grecian drapery, cotton club ephemera, new technology, record players that had just come out, images of cowboys, images of the artists that he was working with. And I think that we see the way that he was able to present these ideas within WilliWear was really seamless. He made what, you know, might have been some incongruous connections appear natural. And I think perhaps also the brand was a form of catharsis for him, because many of the different people that I spoke to referred to him and his personal style as preppy. Ricky Clifton called it preppy drag. And I can't help thinking of that as a Black person, as a form of code switching and protection and armor. Because I also think something we need to think about is the fact that though there are many African-American designers today, which I'm sure we're going to discuss later on, at that point, Willi was really alone. So there was no rubric. So that's also something I think should be considered.
I completely agree.
Here.
Yeah, you did. So I'd like to come back to the fashion is fashion art question. You know, it feels like a battle that's been going on for forever. But what I'm also interested is to know when, you know, in your opinion, guys, when does fashion and art merge so well that they transcend culture? Because to me, that's what Willi Smith was. And the way that he mixed high and low in terms of fashion, he did it with art as well. So what is your take on that? And I'll go with Jared first.
Well, you know, I can't help but think that the ways in which art is being brought into fashion now is in some ways completely antithetical to the way that Willi Smith is working. And so, for instance, you see an image from a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting that is taken and put on the side of a Coach bag. Or you see a David Wojnarowicz image that is put on a Jonathan Anderson thing. You know, those artists had no say in that. The images that they made, whatever their intention, whatever their belief system, and in some cases, the belief system would have been extremely antithetical to being used as a decorative device on a piece of fashion. They had no say in that. It was irrelevant. It was a vision of the designer, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. And I don't even think that that's necessarily wrong. I'm just saying that was different. What Willi was doing was collaborating with people that were his friends, or that he wanted to work with, other people who had visions that he wanted to create something beyond the two of them into this new form. And so he invited artists to work. You know, he worked with Jeanne Claude and Christo, but when he was doing his t-shirt collaborations, he worked with artists who were not very famous. You know, when I talked to Barbara Kruger, who now is like, Barbara Kruger, she said she had not done anything before that. And it was like a big deal to her because it was the first time she ever made a t-shirt. You know what I mean? Think about that. Can we roll our minds back to a moment before Barbara Kruger had made a t-shirt? And so I think that there was a kind of vision about that too, where it's like he could look at someone like Jenny Holzer or Barbara Kruger, or someone now like Lynn Hirschman Leeson, who has to show up at the New Museum, little known San Francisco artist for many years, and say, okay, yeah, design a shirt. I want to see what you're going to do. And part of it was not about branding it as Willi. It was about like whatever the artist's vision was for making this shirt, that was about inspiring the creativity of the people wearing it and people who see it like maybe they should make their own t-shirt, you know? And to me, that is so different than the things that get pegged as art fashion collaborations now.
Oh, great. This is a picture. This is from the artist t-shirts press kit, which included a bunch of images of different models wearing the 23 t-shirts in the first series of artist t-shirts. But this is Willi wearing the Barbara Kruger t-shirt. You can see the Les Levine t-shirt in the back. This is in the site showroom, I think. Thanks for pulling that up, Pierre.
If I could just, oh, Pierre, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was actually going to ask you to go for it.
Oh, great. I was just going to contribute to, I agree with what you just said as well, Jared. I think one of the distinctions between the collaborations and the way that they were executed under Willi versus how many fashion and art collaborations are done today, I think something that differentiated Willi was the familiarity with those other mediums that weren't fashion. When he designed the costumes for Bill T. Jones' performance Secret Pastures, there was a real understanding of movement there. There was an understanding of how the different characters within that performance would interact, what the narrative was. And that was from, just a practice of going to see anything new at the theater, anything new at the opera. That was something that was discussed with many of his friends. There's a real element of research and rigor in Willi Smith's practice that I think is really distinctive. Yeah, that's my main thought.
Mm-hmm.
And Willi?
I would agree with everyone. I mean, for me, the difference is in the process, where you can see if someone is just kind of slapping a painting on a bag, which in itself can serve as a way to bring art to the general public. So if we think about Louis Vuitton and Jeff Koons, Yayoi Kusama, it's all artists that the general public wouldn't have heard of until they saw them in a shop window. But it is a completely different thing than actually having an artistic approach in your process. And I think that's what Willi Smith had. It was basically the process was artistic. The approach, the knowledge, as Camille said, of what he was utilizing. I think for me that's what makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, he talks so much about the performance of the clothes being what's most important, in the context and how they were used. Like if you look at WilliWear garments, they really are basic typological garments that aren't, there is some formal innovation and there's a lot of pulling of references from different types of cultural dress, but ultimately the idea was that the clothing didn't take center stage. It was how the clothing was interpreted by the wearer. And so he saw it as a vehicle for something. And I think that was similar to the collaborations with the artists when it came directly to the artist t-shirts, for example. He saw the t-shirts as a vehicle for the artists to share their work with a broader public who might not have otherwise encountered it. And also a vehicle for, a viewer to have an experience with art on the street, which was so in keeping with so much that was happening with contemporary art at the time, not just Christo and Jeanne Claude, but Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring and, David Hammond, so many artists that were occupying the street in different ways, which is very, very different from how collaborations between artists and fashion designers have evolved, right, over the last 30 years.
I also think a lot of the collaborations were not for profit, which I think is an important distinction. He, in many ways, from my perspective at least, I think Willi Smith, though the brand itself was massively successful, was kind of anti-capitalist in how he presented certain things, like releasing the patterns for his clothing to the general public because people wanted to make his clothes at home. So I think that's important as well. His collaborations with June Paik, the t-shirts were being sold, but I think that came kind of after, the t-shirts were and the uniforms for the Christo and Jeanne Claude projects were made specifically to be used versus sold initially. But correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra.
Well, Well, the t-shirts were sold to fundraise for a public art fund at some point. You know, the first time the t-shirts were shown, they were packaged like posters, you know, on cardboard with cellophane and hung in a gallery space. You know, and they were sold for $30, which at the time was, you know, WilliWear had a policy of like nothing under $100. It really was about trying to keep the prices as low as possible. Um, but but yeah, with some of the collaborations that were installation driven, where artists like June Paik or Juan Downey were invited to create installation for the runway presentations, they were given a sort of carte blanche. You know, they were informed a little bit about, you know, the ideas behind the collection, but they were chosen and invited to participate because they were part of, you know, a creative circle, but also because they shared ideas, you know, with the brand. And so, you know, they were just told, do your thing, like, here's a stage, this is a space, do what you will. And that's also how it was with the makeup artists, you know, with Linda Mason, who came in and was just, you know, said, well, what do you want to do? Like, there was no brief. You know, it wasn't like creating something, you know, within the legacy of the brand, or to connect with, you know, this like very specific messaging point that has come through, you know, a tremendous amount of marketing research. It was very intuitive and improvisational, in a way that I think it definitely, you're right, is distinct from how these collaborations operate today.
I agree, and I feel like with Willi Smith, what's, you know, one of the most important thing is a word that everyone is using, but no one is really living it, is authenticity, and that's what those collaborations were, and that's what they felt, and that's why it's so important to look back at how things were done at the time of Willi Smith. I'd like to ask you guys, which specific or not collection do you remember from Willi Smith, and why?
June Paik, I mean, that was brilliant. I managed to find like a grainy footage of it. And the installation was incredible. So that's the one that's my favorite. And when I was doing the research, you know, the father of video art, and the fact that, you know, Willi Smith had the nose, or maybe they were hanging around together. Maybe, you know, it was the New York scene in the 80s, that they collaborated on that. And it really, the set just looks amazing. It could be today, you know, it would work today for anybody. So that's my favorite.
And Jared, which fashion and art collaboration do you think is the most successfully executed?
By Willi Smith or by someone
By Willi Smith.
Well, you know, I actually think I loved what Camille was saying, and it picked up on a point earlier that Willi had made, or was talking or speaking in relationship to, which is, you know, the idea that if you put a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting on a Coach bag, that's a way for a painting to have a more general audience. But I really think it's such an powerful point to say, like, it is not a way of engaging a more general audience to sell $1,000 bag. It is not a way of speaking. In fact, it's probably doing the opposite of what Willi Smith's impulses were. And I love the way that you kind of underscored that, both Alexandra and Camille, and to say that, yeah, he had a policy that's like, yeah, they made these t-shirts, but they were priced like t-shirts, like slightly more expensive t-shirts. And this also makes me think about the question of branding, and how the Willi Smith name or the Willi Smith brand functioned in relationship to the clothing, and how differently quote unquote brands function now. So it's like, if you want to buy a normal ass black t-shirt that says Balenciaga on it for $600, you can do that. But there's no purpose of that other than performing the name of the brand of Balenciaga as this aspiration towards a certain kind of class position. And Willi Smith is actually giving people tools to undermine that kind of aspirational class mobility to say, like, in fact, like, my name is not on the front of this t-shirt. Like, there aren't clothes that say WilliWear, 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 WilliWear. They have, some of the t-shirts have the logo on the side of the art collaborations, but for the clothes themselves, the statement was the person wearing it. It was the unique ways that they were wearing it. It wasn't that someone looked at you and said, oh, you're wearing WilliWear. I think there are places where he said that would make the clothes a failure. People need to look at you and say, you look amazing for you. And not to say like that WilliWear is functioning as this brand in the same way. So in that sense, I think that, in fact, why is this history, why is this history not known? Why is this not taught in fashion history school? If that's even a thing, I don't know. But it's because it works against every structure that makes the wheels of fashion turn right now. That's what I believe. I believe this is such a radical intervention in the structures of luxury economics that it's every person in the fashion world depends on for their livelihood, for their mode of being. And so why would you want to foreground that? Why would you want to recenter a discourse of fashion around someone that's cutting you off at the knees?
I would also add that.
Great point.
We're all so passionate about that point. I also think he was erased simply because he died of AIDS and because he's Black. I think that he presented an idea of what American fashion could be that is actually extremely threatening to the people who generally dictate what American culture is. But I think it's important to understand what you were saying about him being, the brand essentially being classless. This was a man who, not classless, not as in tasteless, classless as in no class. This was a man who designed the groomswear for a Kennedy wedding, but also, as you said, Alexandra, all the clothes were under $100. Almost all the clothes were under $100. And that's basically all I want to say on that. But in response to your question, Pierre, about our favorite collaborations, mine tend to be the Bill T. Jones performance, Secret Pastures, and also in terms of my favorite collection, the Deep South suite that he did in 1976 with Diane McIntyre, that I thought was fabulous.
Why?
Why? Because he's referencing a culture, the Black South, which he maybe didn't necessarily experience that much growing up, but the Deep South essentially affects all African-American people. We were brought here as slaves and generally came from that region. And I think it was a beautiful collection because just purely aesthetically, the women looked amazing. The volume was dramatic. The fact that it was choreographed by Diane McIntyre, I think really but added another dimension to the clothes and their presentation and the imagination. And I think that they're also representative of this aspect of Willi that I personally find very compelling. He was able to provide really kind of seething and scathing social commentary in very subtle ways. And that's part of why he was so popular amongst all American people, Black and white, because not everyone necessarily understood the references he was making, but he was making them nonetheless. I think that's important and something that I don't personally see that much today.
That's true. Alexandra, do you want to answer that question? Which one is your favorite collection or your favorite art collaboration of Willi Smith?
I mean, it's so hard for me to pick, but I did see a question in the chat about art as damaged goods. And so maybe it's the first thing in the exhibition. It's the first thing you see. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that because I found it to be incredibly poignant when I learned about this particular exhibition, which happened at PS1 before it was MoMA PS1. In 1982, and a stylist named Hollywood DeRusso was asked by Alana Heiss, who was the director of PS1 at the time, to invite some young fashion designers to show their work in PS1. And most of the presentations were pretty formal. They emphasized the garments, they gave a sense of the designer's work. And Willi Smith chose to create this installation, which was titled Art is Damaged Goods. And he took his basic garments, labeled them in the most straightforward, minimal way, shirt, pants, skirt, plastered them and laid them out on the floor of one of the school rooms, his PS1, the school room, with evidence markers. And I'm really interested in this particular installation because it is quite unlike any of the other things, also related to the question of Willi Smith being an artist. This is a sculpture, and it is a direct critique of the fashion industry. And the planned obsolescence of clothing, and the returning of garments that have minor damage to the manufacturer, and and the idea of waste. So in a way, he's prefacing the conversation that we're having now around fast fashion, even before there was an environmental discussion about the impact of fast fashion, which I think is really complicated to talk about, also because WilliWear was complicit and really inspired a lot of ideas about fashion marketing that have led to brands like Zara or H&M, marketing very affordable, mass-produced garments in a way that pushes seasonal trends and aspiration in a way that WilliWear was against and was trying to undermine, as Jarrett mentioned. So we were lucky to recreate Art is Damaged Goods for the exhibition at the museum, and we have some photographs documenting it, done by the photographer Kim Steele, who's a friend of Willi Smith's and Laurie's, that are in the book and on the community archive. But you can also go to MoMA's website to read some more about that. We were very happy that they gave us permission to recreate it in the show. So that one is very, very important, I think, in understanding the oeuvre of WilliWear and Willi Smith.
Yeah, I wanted to touch quickly on Jarrett's comment about a classless approach to fashion and creation, and it's something that's come back on the table with Talfar Clemens. So with his bag, the Talfar bag, it's called the Bushwick Birkin. Yes. So they are exploring this idea of a luxury brand without luxury, with his business partner Babak Ragboy, and it seems conceptual in 2021, but pretty much that's what Willi was doing. It's somewhere else with this idea. When you fast forward a few years down the line, we can see the prophecy of it. So Talfar is trying to create this classless approach to fashion, and by building a community as well around African American working class or middle class African American as the audience. And if you look at the social media, it's pretty much, he's not doing aspirational fashion. He's speaking to and featuring that community as, his models, and he's the people that uses the bag.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, completely. I think, Talfar is definitely following in Willi Smith's footsteps. Camille, I'm really interested in your opinion. How do you understand this appeal for street couture today and the influence that Willi Smith has on designers today and the way people dress?
Well, I think, just to add one more thing to what Willi said, Talfar's tagline is "not for you, for everyone," which is perhaps even more pointed than Willi at that time. I think his influence stems from a desire, in the 80s, and in the 80s there was an entirely different economic setup, or a different economic state in this country. Now we're no longer in that state, where the idea of American supremacy is kind of crumbling. whether you're on the left or on the right, and people are responding to it in different ways. I think that designers today who are kind of implementing the Willi Smith format or rubric acknowledge that, and also understand that perhaps this might also be the economic state in which we live might also dovetail with a kind of flip of authority. People no longer just want to appear as if they have more money than they do. Many people who have money want to appear as if they don't have money. I also think that specifically with the Telfar bag, because of the way it's set up, the way it's presented, the age of the drop, which I think extends outside of just fashion, it is technically accessible to everyone, but the people who generally could call Bloomingdale's, have something reserved, go pick it up, be on a waiting list, they can't access the Bushwick Birkin in that way. Now, you know, I have friends who are artists whose gallerists are calling them to make sure they can get the bag for them. You know, so it's kind of, it flips things on its head. And I also think it speaks to so many people wanting to align themselves with Blackness, with artists who have generally been an outsider group. And I think that is, that's a cultural phenomena that's really unique to this moment and unique to the last 10 or 20 years. And I think a few of the other people that followed in Willi Smith's path, I think in referencing what Alexandra was saying earlier about some of these larger brands like Zara, I definitely think Uniqlo takes a lot of pages out of that book, specifically with their artist collab t-shirts, which are, I think, the most explicit example of what Willi Smith started. But I also think in terms of streetwear and appearing effortless and cool in the way that Willi started, I think there are brands like Rocawear, Baby Fat, Sean John. I also think that there was this kind of gender fluidity about WilliWear that I think also could be seen in Hood by Air or Telfar also. And I think I've seen some comparisons to WilliWear that I think actually don't line up. Pyre Moss, for example. I think that in our rush to kind of explain Willi's impact, sometimes his rigor is forgotten, if that makes sense.
And Jared, I saw you shake your hand at some point. Tell me your views on that.
Well, I mean, I can't say it any better. I just thought it was such a insightful and incisive breakdown of the complexity of trying to identify him within a lineage, because in some ways it's always projection backwards, which is what history is, because we need Willi Smith now. You know what I mean? Like, Willi Smith is like necessary to think with and to live with now, to the problems that we're dealing with. And so in some ways we do want to rush to reclaim him and say like, oh, of course, like he influenced these people. But in fact, and I love the way that she diagrammed this, is I think what we're really looking at is resonances, and those kind of resonances have to do with the way people at this moment are solving the specific problems of getting dressed right now, with a bigger framework of what those problems entail. And those problems entail global capital. Those problems entail like the environment. Those problems entail now dealing with the kind of incredible devastation of the fast fashion industry, you know? And so we can look back at Willi Smith and say, well, there was someone who was thinking these thoughts and attempting to address them in his own way. And somehow that is both more and less clear than the term influence might appear. I mean, I think it's more like what's happening right now is happening because he is so contemporary. And of course, there's going to be a lot of contemporary designers who are in conversation with that. So
I also want to just add one thing to that. The pace is different. When Willi was designing, he could truly go on trips. He could research, he could think, he could marinate. He could just be by himself in his apartment, listening to opera, flipping through books, and put all of that time and that consideration into the work. The fashion calendar now is completely a different thing. And I think, I don't think that there is a direct descendant from Willi. I don't think anyone has been able to kind of recreate that essence, because it's not possible to recreate it. I think that there's also this humility that was central to him as an individual and his work, that I think is kind of antithetical to our current culture and just, social media, how we interact with each other. I think there are a lot of people who take pieces from Willi's legacy, but I think to really be, he's influenced a lot, but I think to really be able to find someone who has that same impact now is difficult for a number of reasons, if that makes sense.
I completely agree with you. Alexandra, did you want to add anything less on that? Because I would love to talk about fashion and identity and how Willi Smith was a completely intersectional being in the way he created and mixed gender and race, obviously, and sexuality into his work. Or do you want to go into that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was glad that Camille also made the point, about Telfar, even Eckhaus Lada or GmbH, different brands that are thinking about gender fluidity, because that was something that was really important to Willi Smith and WilliWear, and something that I think has only started to become apparent in the last couple of years. And, maybe speaking also more to what Camille said and segueing into the identity conversation, I think even as, we've been talking about Willi Smith since the book came out and the exhibition, and, there are many people who've been talking about Willi Smith for a long time. I think what we tapped into was a community of people who've been waiting to have a real conversation about Willi Smith, and needed a broader platform to maybe create a concentration around this discussion, to reflect on what is happening with the fashion world, with corporate art commissions, with discussions of design and architecture, and often Willi Smith is still today immediately categorized within a list of Black designers. And it's important to talk about him within the lineage of the business of fashion, right? Of being a designer who realized that when he was working for another brand, he could not do what he wanted to do and needed to own his own brand and be his own boss, and have his own investors, his own partners in order to do this. But I find it to be frustrating still, that talking about Willi Smith becomes a question of only talking about Telfar, only talking about Virgil Abloh, only talking about a legacy of streetwear, because, the conversation can only be limiting from there. But that's the gut reaction still today in the fashion press.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's true. I agree with you that there's a lot more than, I feel like sometimes Willi Smith is reduced to streetwear, and the idea that that's what a Black designer can bring to the table and to the conversation, when really it was a lot broader than that. And it was, to me, like I said earlier, culturally relevant, in the sense that it transcended fashion. I'm really interested in you guys' opinion about identity and how a Black designer like Willi Smith or Black designers today can use their identity and their race as in a way that, sorry, let me just rephrase that, can use their race and identity to convey certain values through their work. That's what I mean. Willi, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to tackle the full thing, and I think Camille will do a great job as well, and Jarrett has some point of view. But I would say that what's happening now with the rise of technology, the conversations that started happening, especially with, the group of students in creative that came out of St. Martin's, including you, here in Europe, is to make people realize that fashion does not belong to one race. And everybody was gaslighted into believing that, fashion belonged to one race, and there's only one way of doing it. There's only one approach. There's only one type of beauty that everybody should aspire to, which is blonde with blue eyes. So it's dismantling this entire idea of fashion being almost like a tool for, and I'm not using the word white supremacy in the extreme example of white supremacy, but the idea that one race is the only that's beautiful, one way of dressing is the only that's valid. And for me, designers like Willi Smith, he had kind of a very inclusive approach, which is where we should be headed. Again, he's sort of a visionary. Even if you haven't heard of him, when you study him, you realize his ideas were very visionary, meaning that it's a decentering whiteness as a tool of sales, or whiteness as a tool of, for fashion, and including everybody else. His lookbooks were very inclusive. It was inspired by his sister was included, but as well, he had white models, Latinos. So it was this vision of kind of encompassing all kinds of identity in how he would present his clothes. So that's point one, which is what I like about him, is the fact that he dissented, but he didn't get rid of, it's not about replacing one race by another. It is about, realizing that fashion is for everyone. And when it comes to identity as a Black creative, I mean, it obviously is, your work, is attached to identity, your roots, where you grew up, and it should be included in your work and your design for a lot of them. I don't know in the US, but we've got in South Africa, Kenneth Eze, we've got Tebe Magugu, who's bringing his point of view from South Africa, and I love that. And he's, being celebrated in Paris and coming into the international sort of platform, or those international cities for fashion. And that's a healthier version of the industry, and that's what we need to get to when it comes to design and dressing, is the fact that it's a human endeavor. It's nothing to do with race and kind of promoting one race over another.
Jareth, I'm really interested in your opinion about that, the relationship between race and design, and how artists and fashion designers can use race as a way to convey certain messages.
Well, I think, his term was street couture, and we credit him as like the father of streetwear. And I think it's really important to think about the streets that he was in, So it's not the New York City of today, which is actually highly segregated along race and class boundaries, where you could live certain lives in certain parts of the city and just not happen to see a lot of people that don't look like you, which is actually one of the reasons why we're living in hell right now. But New York City of the 70s and 80s, it was not like that. It was a highly mixed and integrated part, especially the downtown where he was living. And you see that in the fashion. And I think one of the things that is so extraordinary about his work and his point of view is there is this radical inclusivity in which he could draw from everything that he saw. He could draw from high, he could draw from low, he could draw from people with all kinds of different national and ethnic traditions that were different from his growing up in Philadelphia. And it wasn't about subsuming them, it was about celebrating some part of it that could then be worn in these other these other instances. And I actually think that there is something within that that is so utopian and cuts against the grain of our discourse right now in ways that I would love to see some, serious fashion scholar kind of work through, because when you look at the clothes, you look at the images, you look at the fabrics. I mean, these clothes were being made in India, and he took a lot of inspiration from Indian textiles, and that was very important to him from a kind of an ethical standpoint around what it meant to give people natural fibers to wear. But so, yeah, I would say I can't speak to his inner life, and I can't speak to how he expressed his particular racial or sexual position within his work, but I can say that I'm very humbled by the rigor and the breadth of his vision. And it's the kind of vision that was like, could move in the world in extremely promiscuous ways, And I think that is what's so extraordinary.
Camille, do you want to go for it?
Sure. Well, I have a lot of thoughts about him and identity and his identity, but first I just want to cap on what Alexandra said most recently. I think that there's this reluctance also to acknowledge how much Willi Smith affected and influenced white designers. I think a lot of people fall within his lineage. Donna Karan, for instance, Ralph Lauren, though they both began designing around the same time. I think just formally, much of his work, I see similarities between Willi Smith's early work. Also, when I was researching him for my piece, I had quite a difficult time finding Black friends of his to speak to. There was one woman in particular, Clarice Armand, who I spoke with, and I really wanted to get her perspective on how Willi reconciled being Black in what was mostly, though the city, as Jarrett said, was not as segregated as it is now, it was still segregated to an extent. And Willi's friend group, from my estimation, seemed to be mostly white. Now, there are, and I think that had to do maybe more with just the economic level that he was at towards the end of his life, and how few Black people, especially at that time, could get into that economic bracket. But one quote stands out to me in particular that Kim Hastreiter shared with me. Well, they're her words. She said Willi was not too gay, not too hip, and not too famous to hug you. And I would also add to that, not too Black. And we can unpack what that even really means. And then, that connects also to Ricky Clifton's comment about his style being preppy drag. He had, when I spoke to Clarice, she was speaking about how Willi would share with her, not frequently, but he would share with her his frustration about the kind of mask that he had to wear to the world. He was a media darling, and I think also the media is the main locus for why he's been erased today, the media and institutions, and perhaps less so educational institutions, more so, museums, for instance. He's not included in the Met's show on America right now, which to me is rather pointed. But he did have to put a mask on. He was frustrated with the idiosyncrasies of being famous and beloved and also being Black at that moment. Of course, everything that we could guess about his interior world is all conjecture, because we'll never truly know, we'll never be able to ask him. But my perspective on how he moved through the world was, I think he was fixated, or not fixated, but really focused on appearing non-threatening, on kind of eradicating the threat in America, at least, that is the Black man, that is the Black man's body. I've heard, I don't remember exactly who I heard this from, but towards the end of his career, it seemed like he had to really start pushing back with the media, who still viewed him as a boy. And I think that kind of dovetails with just the infantilization of Black people in America, which continues today. He really had to kind of be a bit more forceful in presenting his brand and him as an individual, as a man, as as a gay man. And also there was this one moment when, you know, Alexandra mentioned that he was in Parsons, but he was also kicked out of Parsons when it became clear that he was in a gay romantic relationship. And I think that moment at that time and at that age had to have affected him. It had to have been something internalized. And he was never closeted, but he was also very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very private about his sex life and his romantic life. The two romantic partners of his that I was able to unearth were both white also, which I think is a neutral thing, but I think is still something that, you know, needs to be considered. So I think that there was a lot of turmoil. And I think that, you know, Rosemary Peck's comment about Willi being someone who could cross over, again, I think also plays into just the individual identity that it seemed to me that he was shaping and molding and shifting each day.
Sorry. I think we'll have time for questions now, but I kind of wanted to ask each of the panelists one last word about Willi Smith's legacy or creativity, something that needs to be remembered. Alexandra, do you want to start?
I think I'd like to riff off of something that Jarrett said about thinking about history and influence. I like the idea of imagining why we need a designer like Willi Smith now, and to think about, you know, what he was trying to do with his life and with his brand, right? And to think about how might we, sorry to be, you know, a design question person, but I guess ultimately I am representing the design segment of this conversation. Like, how might we, you know, create a community, a business, a life like Willi Smith's? And so I think the most powerful aspect of having organized this exhibition and worked on the archive and spoken to so many people who have been like thinking about Willi Smith and grappling with all of the things that we've talked about today, you know, in this conversation about, you know, why he didn't receive a certain degree of recognition, or, you know, what it meant for him to be like the first at this and the first at that, and introducing these like new ways of thinking about how fashion can operate, you know, as a tool of equity or as a means to get to where you want to go in your life, to move, is really that, you know, when you sit down and read his quotes, you know, and read his statements, they coalesce really into, you know, a blueprint for thinking about being an open, giving, and creative person. And what we've heard most frequently from people who remember Willi Smith is how he made them feel, right? He made people feel good about themselves. And that was a major aspect of what he was trying to do, to empower people, you know, which is a word that has sort of like lost its strength because it's used so much. But he wanted to do that, and he was successful at doing that, even with people who he didn't know, you know, who've written into the archive to say, I wore WilliWear to my prom and I felt like someone understood, you know, like what I needed to feel comfortable in clothing to allow me to make choices that felt authentic to myself. So yeah, that's something that has been really powerful, and I think is something that we can continue to consider about Willi Smith and be inspired by.
Willi, what would you say?
I think for me, what stood out researching him and throughout the conversation is, even if you haven't heard of him, it's the importance of visionaries in our industry, because both you and me are part of the fashion industry. I think that's the only two people here in the panel. And within the fashion industry, you sometimes get that kind of talent that comes in and gives you a blueprint of how to answer certain questions that we're going to be faced with, you know, now or in 10 years. Ray Kawakubo is one of them. Willi Smith is another one where I think visionaries are really important in the way that they operate, in the way that they think, in the way that they design their business. So that's number one. So visionaries should be taught, should be studied, and should provide an inspiration for the rest of us in the industry when we're trying to move forward and answer certain questions and operate in a certain way. So that's one thing with Willi Smith. The other thing is, for me, he's kind of a symbol of, despite all the issues and like Camille pointed out about, not being able to live his full identity within the industry, is that he's an inspiration for a lot of the young kids trying to kind of make it as, people of color in the industry. He was as big as Ralph Lauren. I mean, what Ralph Lauren became. He was an all-American designer. I mean, wrap your head around that. That is insane. It's quite incredible for a Black designer that came from, Philadelphia and created this business, which had a short span and nobody kept it going because of the association of him having HIV/AIDS and the issues of selling the clothes in that sense. And the stigma that was attached to, his death. But he's still a huge inspiration for people of color, and saying, I too can create this all-American brand, which I think Talfa is doing. Not for Alexandra. I'm not putting him in the sort of the streetwear box, but I'm just saying, as an inspiration, I think Talfa has the same level of ambition. When you read his interviews, he's sort of like, well, I want to be as big as the Gap, or I want to be as big as, I don't want to be this tiny kind of mom and pop's business. So for me, he's an inspiration and he's a visionary. And if you haven't heard of him, then you should go and study the way he operated and worked.
Camille?
Well, I have 2 points. First off, that phrase of his, style over status. I think that he's a great example of kind of socialism within design. Maybe that's not the perfect word, but I think gets the point across. And I don't think he wanted to be the first, but I think as the first, he wanted to lift up the second, the third, the fourth. And I think that's something that is harder to find today. I think that, white supremacy has kind of encouraged this. There can only be one concept, and there can only be one Black designer Couture week, and it has to be the Black designer that white people have chosen to be included. I think that something we need to think about in connection to Willi Smith is inclusion, not just in terms of race, but in terms of Black people including each other. And I think second, one thing that I think he really deserves remembering for is the rigor and the research that he put into his work, and I think, the proof is in the pudding. The work is exceptional. Work continues to be exceptional today. And, though we don't have necessarily the same kind of settings, speaking to how many fashion weeks there are, fashion months really at this point every year, and how much people are expected to produce, I do think that with the right amount of ambition and the right amount of determination, and people outside of fashion as well, designers, artists, people who work in corporate atmospheres, writers, curators, everything, the rigor and the research, I think are the number one thing to really highlight from Willi's memory.
Jared?
Oh, well, I'm so moved by the things everyone has already said. I loved Willi talking about Willi Smith as a visionary. And to me, what that means to me is that as we celebrate Willi Smith, and this exhibition and this catalog has been such an amazing opportunity to celebrate and to introduce and to learn. But the way, what it really means to be a visionary to me is that the work is present as a challenge. It's a challenge for us. It is a challenge for the future to meet the level of that vision. And I think that part of what really connected me to, and like part of where I'm experiencing that challenge is at the level of writing, which is like, how do we tell the story of a thinker and a mind and a life like Willi Smith as a narrative problem, as a problem of history telling? And that is like, dovetails with my you know, a lot of my work lately and where my heart really is these extraordinary generation of people who died of AIDS. And how do we engage with these histories that were just completely truncated and buried, and allow them to, the weight of the loss of them to really be felt. Like, I honestly believe if Willi Smith had not died in 1987, we would live in a different world. I truthfully believe that. And so how can we approach representing that, or just even meditating on that? And one of the anecdote that I want to share that was the most powerful to me when I was researching Willi Smith was finding the anecdote in the book about the AIDS quilt of the guy who had made Willi Smith's panel on the quilt. And he was just like a gay guy in San Francisco who would sewed. His grandmother taught him how to sew. And it was really important to his identity and like being a gay man. And then the first clothes he ever made for himself were from Willi Smith patterns that Willi published with Butterick's in the 70s. And when Willi Smith died, he was working at like the AIDS crisis center in San Francisco at the time. And he had an enormous number of friends that were dying. And he said, I have to make this tribute to Willi Smith because he affected my life. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he was a famous person. He never met Willi Smith, but through the clothes, through the fashion, through the representation of being a queer person who could move in the world in this way and care about beauty and life, you know, it led this man to make this gesture. And I was so moved by that. You know, it was really touching to me. And I think what's so touching is the indirectness of it, the way that, you know, you put something out and you don't actually know. You know, Willi Smith never knew this guy. Willi Smith never knew he changed some weird guy's life, many, many people's lives. But nevertheless, that's the way it works. And so that to me is also a challenge for what we understand history and art and fashion to be. And I hope that I can continue trying to meet that challenge under the rubric of Willi Smith for years and years, because it's so immense.
Wow, thank you. I don't want to take too much time from the panelists, but I just want to say that a few days ago I posted, sorry guys, a few days ago I posted some photos of some of his best collections, in my opinion, fall winter 85, SS 86. And what struck me is dozens of messages from people all around the world of all ages, understanding what was happening in terms of creativity, in terms of cultural impact. And I was very moved by, you know, a 22-year-old in the middle of Italy who had never probably heard of Willi Smith before, and who told me that, you know, this could be now. And to me, this universal aspect of his work through the art collaborations and through the clothes themselves is what make it so powerful today. And that's why, in my opinion, we shouldn't forget about Willi Smith. We're gonna head to the questions now, and we have a few questions. Let's start with, was his name licensed when, and the label his signature? So Alexandra, I'll let you answer that, but I think Willi Smith incorporated the first company from 74 to 76. It was called Willi Smith Design, and which bankrupt. And then WilliWear was established in 76. Right? Did I get that
good,
right?
Good history. Okay. Good history. Yeah. Yeah. And there was so sort of the second mark of that is after Willi Smith passed, there were a couple of years where the brand continued under the WilliWear moniker, and several different designers were brought in to work on the brand, and an anonymous design team. And so there are a couple of years. But then, you know, a few different corporate brands came in and acquired the Willi Smith name. And for some period of time, also WilliWear, which is why you see many clothes from the 90s on with a Willi Smith label, different from the ones that were pre-1990, which is sort of black and white. And then there was one that he made with his profile with the glasses and his signature. There are a few different, like 1976 to 1987, then 1987 to 1990 WilliWear labels that are really recognizable. But you see like a Willi Smith label that it does not come from the Willi and Lori owned brand. Yeah, for many years and possibly still. Mm-hmm.
We have another question. Were Willi's clothes designed more towards men or women? Willi Smith designed both men's and menswear and women's wear. So I don't think there was a particular target for his clothes. I think it was about people and about people who wanted to look a certain way and different. Again, if anyone wants to enter that and add anything to it, feel free to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question. Did he also live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at some point?
I only know.
I don't.
Oh, sorry, Allison. I only know of his Lispenard Street apartment, which is the one that Rosemary Peck has images for that we used for Apartamento magazine. And before that, he lived in the West Village on Horatio Street in an apartment that the designer Vincent Wolf designed. But I don't know that he lived on the Upper West Side. I do know that he socialized on the Upper West Side.
And we have one last question. Given his unfortunate dismissal from Parsons, how did he make his initial connection in the fashion world?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Willi Smith designed for a company called Digits in Alexandria. I'm not sure I'll get this date right, but I think he started in 69.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is that, you know, he had a reputation of being one of the most talented students to ever apply to Parsons. So people knew who he was when he was still a student. And so he started working on 7th Avenue for sportswear brands pretty much right away. And then, you know, moved his way up really, really quickly to be the lead designer at Digits, and then, you know, decided that he wanted to strike out on his own. So his reputation lifted him into immediate job opportunities.
I think that was all the questions. I think it's also, I would just like to remind everyone we didn't really think about that because we didn't have time probably, but Willi Smith was nominated for the Couture Awards in '67, which, you know, is quite incredible when you think about this. These were almost like the Oscars of fashion. And he eventually in '85 won that same award. And to think of Black designers today not being nominated for whether it's the CFDA, it's changed because of Black Lives Matter in 2020 happened. But for the longest time, it was very rare to see Black designers being nominated for prize and being recognized by the industry. So I think it's important to point out that even in that, he was, you know, ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm.
So should we does anyone else wants to say something before we wrap this up?
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for everyone who joined. Alexandra, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I mean, it was incredible to have this conversation with you. I know that our impeccable education team is going to follow up to everyone who joined us today with a link to the conversation. So there will be a video online and on our website so that the discussion can be revisited in the future. I would encourage anyone who had more questions, who wants to explore a little bit, to visit the Willi Smith Digital Community Archive site, which has all of the essays from the book and conversations published for free. So we would love for you to buy the book, but of course, everything is accessible there, including a bunch of recollections, videos, archival film, a lot to go through. Yes, and please, I mean, every single person on this panel has such an inspiring impact on the worlds of art and fashion and design. So please continue to follow their own work beyond today, if it's the first time that you're meeting them. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
Okay. Thank you, Pierre.